and the leader of our party, Keir Starmer.
And thank you, Jade. They were such powerful words. Thank you for that introduction. The election results last week were tough. Very tough. We lost some brilliant Labour representatives. That hurts. And it should hurt. I get it. I feel it. And I take responsibility. But it's not just about taking responsibility for the results. It's about taking responsibility to explain how, as a political and electoral force, we will be better and do better in the months and years ahead. Because we are not just facing dangerous times, but dangerous opponents, very dangerous opponents. This hurts not just because Labour has done badly, but because if we don't get this right, our country will go down a very dark path. So just as I take responsibility for the results, I also take responsibility for delivering the change that we promised, for a stronger and fairer Britain that we must build. I take responsibility for navigating us through a world that is more dangerous than at any time in my life. And I take responsibility for not walking away, not plunging our country into chaos as the Tories did time and again, chaos that did lasting damage to this country. A Labour government would never be forgiven for inflicting that on our country again. I know that people are frustrated by the state of Britain, frustrated by politics, and some people frustrated with me. I know I have my doubters, and I know I need to prove them wrong, and I will. So let me start on a personal note. Like every Prime Minister, I've learned a lot in the first 2 years in the job. In terms of the policy challenges that our country faces, incremental change won't cut it. On growth, defence, Europe, energy, we need a bigger response than we anticipated in 2024. Because these are not ordinary times. And this is a political challenge just as much as it's a policy challenge. Delivery is, of course, essential, but it's not sufficient on its own to address the frustration that voters feel. We're battling Reform and the Greens, but at a deeper level, we're battling the despair on which they prey, despair that they exploit and amplify. And so analysis matters, but argument matters more. Evidence matters, but so too does emotion. Stories beat spreadsheets. People need hope. So we will face up to the big challenges, and we will make the big arguments, the Labour case, that only Labour values and Labour policies can ensure our country not only weathers these storms, but emerges stronger and fairer. And the Labour case, that neither Nigel Farage nor Zach Polansky offers our country the serious progressive leadership that these times demand. Of course, like every government, we've made mistakes. But we got the big political choices right. I mean, if we'd listened to the advice of other parties, right now we'd be stuck in a standoff with Iran, having been dragged into a war that is not in our interest, and I will never do that. We have invested in our public services, in people, in the pride of Britain's communities. Difficult decisions funded that. But now, NHS waiting lists are coming down. Child poverty is coming down. Immigration is coming down. And we are rebuilding from the ground up. They were the right calls. And most of all, we stabilised the economy. The fundamentals are sound. And that matters because it puts us in a much better place to come out of the conflict in Iran stronger and fairer, and for living standards to improve after 2 decades of stagnation. But that's not enough, clearly. No. For the British people, tired of a status quo that has failed them, change cannot come quickly enough. And truth be told, I'm not sure that they believe that we care. I'm not sure they believe that we see their lives. That's tough to say. When you come from a working class background like me, it's hard to hear that. Because I do know what it's like to struggle and to strive. But what I take from it is that I've spent too much time talking about what I am doing for working people and not enough time talking about why or who I stand for. Because I can see how hard life has been during these decades of crisis. I can see that very clearly. My late brother Nick spent all his adult life going from one job to the next. The status quo did not work for him. My sister is a carer, working long hours on low pay, year after year after year. She didn't even get sick pay in the pandemic. Too long we've ignored people like that. And there are millions of people in that boat, millions of people who don't get the dignity, the respect, the chance that they deserve to go as far as their talent and effort should take them. Millions of people held back because the status quo in this country does not work for them. I am fighting for them. We are fighting for them. I am their Prime Minister and this is their government. Because I know whose side I'm on. I'm on the side of working people just like my sister. People who work harder and harder, but who worry about the cost of living. They're not asking for the world. They just want to do the best for their kids. They want their town centres, the places they care about, to thrive, their public services to work, and people in power to see their problems. And right now, they're worried sick. They turn on the TV, they see bombs falling. They go to the petrol station, see prices rising, and they think, how is this happening to us again? They say, how can I be paying the price for a war thousands of miles away that I don't support, that Britain isn't involved in? And it's not a new feeling, is it? For 2 decades, our country has been buffeted by crisis after crisis. The 2008 financial crash, the Tory austerity that followed it, Brexit, COVID, the Ukraine war, on and on it goes. And the response is always the same. A desperate attempt to get back to the status quo, a status quo that failed working people time and again. Our response this time must be different. A complete break. We must make this country stronger, take control of our economic security, our energy security, our defence security, and we must make this country fairer. Strength through fairness. That is my compass in this world. It is a core Labour argument. And in the coming days, you will see those values writ large in the King's speech. And you will see hope, urgency, and exactly whose side we're on reflected in everything we say and everything we do. So let me give you 3 examples today, starting with British Steel. Because what we did in Scunthorpe last year is one of the proudest things we have done in government. That plant was hours away from closure, and that is thousands of jobs gone, an entire region decimated, Britain's security exposed. And so we acted. Parliament was in recess, but it didn't matter. As a united Labour Party, we passed emergency legislation and we took control. And we must bring that same urgency to everything now, starting, appropriately enough, with Scunthorpe, because steel is the ultimate sovereign capability. Strong nations in a world like this need to make steel. That's why we're backing steel in Port Talbot and across the UK. But in Scunthorpe, we've been negotiating with the current owner, and a commercial sale has not been possible. And now a public interest test could be met. So I can announce that legislation will be brought forward this week to give the government powers, subject to that public interest test, to take full national ownership of British Steel. Public ownership in the public interest, urgent government on the side of working people, making Britain stronger with the hope of industrial renewal. That is a Labour choice. Second example, Europe. And I'm sorry, but I need to take a bit of a detour on this, because I want to remind you what Nigel Farage said about Brexit. He said it would make us richer. Wrong. It made us poorer. He said it would reduce migration. Wrong. Migration went through the roof. He said it would make us more secure. Wrong again. It made us weaker. He took Britain for a ride, and unlike the Tories, actually, who at least had to face up to it, he just fled the scene. And now he'll talk about almost anything other than the consequences of the one policy he actually delivered. Because he's not just a grifter, he is a chancer. And so at the next EU summit, I will set a new direction for Britain. The last government was defined by breaking our relationship with Europe. This Labour government will be defined by rebuilding our relationship with Europe, by putting Britain at the heart of Europe, so that we are stronger on the economy, stronger on trade, stronger on defence, you name it. Because standing shoulder to shoulder with the countries that most share our interests, our values, and our enemies, that is the right choice for Britain. That is the Labour choice. And for our young people, also something more. Because Brexit snatched away their ability to work, to study, and to live easily in Europe. That's why I'm proud we restored the Erasmus scheme. But I want to go further. I want to make a better offer for our young people. Restore that hope, that freedom, that sense of possibility. And so I want an ambitious youth experience scheme to be at the heart of our new arrangement with the EU, so that our young people can work and study and live in Europe, a symbol of a stronger relationship and a fairer future with our closest allies. That is the Labour choice. And third, the greatest hope. The hope that every parent has of a better future for their children. And I want parents to feel that that is shared by their government. Now, my parent, don't worry, I'm not going there. But they didn't have a lot of money. And my mum was seriously ill for almost all of her life. But when they were in their later years, reflecting on what gave their life meaning, I could see that, as well as their hope in us, their kids, what comforted them was the idea that they had contributed to a Britain that was getting better for young people, that kids now had a better opportunity than they did. And so I have always been driven by the idea that every child should go as far as their talent or effort takes them. It's a beautiful idea. Stories about it, don't we? Stories, not unlike mine, about the working class kids who do make it. And I don't blame people for telling those stories. It's important to tell those stories. But it's not everyone, is it? So when I say every child should have the opportunity to go as far as their talent or effort takes them, I mean every child. I mean the kids who are growing up in poverty, the kids who have special educational needs, the kids who can't get a job, and the kids who are ignored, frankly, because society often only puts those who go to university on a pedestal. We don't really see anything else as success. And that is wrong, deeply wrong. So we will go much further on our investment in apprenticeships, in technical excellence colleges, in special educational needs. We will make sure that every young person struggling to find a job will get a guaranteed offer of a job, training or work placement. And we will go much further with our Pride in Place programme. Back the millions of people who give their time and their effort to young people in their community. We will back them, not just with money, but with power. And we will make sure that kids whose talent lies with their hands, kids who go to college, kids ignored by the status quo, because politicians' kids don't go there, they will finally get the respect that they deserve in a stronger, fairer Britain. That is the Labour choice. These are just a few examples, but they show the urgency in hope in our direction. They show the Labour values we will be guided for. And they show, frankly, the lessons that we will learn. Now, other parties will draw different lessons. In fact, they already are. They want more grievance politics, more division, more pointing at Britain's problems, looking not for solutions, but for someone to blame. Now, that's fine if it's me, if it's politicians, that's the job. But increasingly, it's not. It's other people in this country. And I don't think that's British. That is not the decency and respect that we are known for. But it's here. That politics is with us now. And you'll see it again on Saturday at a march designed to confront and intimidate this diversity and this diverse country. That is why this Labour government will block far-right agitators from travelling to Britain for that event. Because we will not allow people to come to the UK, to threaten our communities, and spread hate on our streets. This is nothing less than a battle for the soul of our nation. And I want to be crystal clear about how we will win it. Because we cannot win as a weaker version of Reform or the Greens. We can only win as a stronger version of Labour, a mainstream party of power, not protest. And I also want to be really clear on this, because I will never stop fighting for the decent, respectful, diverse country that I love. I will never give up on the hope we can unlock in this country, the hope of renters for security in their home, of workers for fairness at work, of public services freed from austerity, the hope of European solidarity, of community pride, of the people who paint over the graffiti that is racist, a country taking control of its future, our spirit unchanged, our resolve unbroken, the hope of a country that can and will become a stronger, fairer Britain. That is the hope I'm fighting for. That is the hope we are fighting for. That is the Labour choice. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm now going to take some questions from the media, and I'm starting with Chris Mason. Chris.
Thank you. Chris Mason, BBC News. Prime Minister, do you think in your gut what you have said is enough this morning? And what do you say directly to those of your colleagues who are weighing up right now whether to back you or to suggest that you should go? And if I may, would you back continuing to block Andy Burnham from trying to return to Parliament?
Well, Chris, there's a lot packed into that question. What I'm doing is setting out the response, the direction that we need to take, and the acknowledgement that in the world we live in now, we need a bigger response than 2024. It is a different world, and an acknowledgement that this isn't the first shock the country's been through with the Iran conflict. We've had plenty of those in the last 20 years, but every time the government of the day has tried to get back to a status quo that doesn't work. And we're not going to do that this time. That is the urgent task facing our country. We were elected into office to change this country, to bring about the change that is needed. The frustration that has been spoken about is a frustration of at least 20 years, if not more. That is what we're charged with changing. That is what we will change. In relation to Andy Burnham, obviously, any future decision is for the NEC. Andy's doing a great job as mayor in Manchester. And I actually work really well with Andy, and I'll give you two examples. On Northern Powerhouse Rail, which is really important for the North West. We are working together on that project. But equally, we've stood together to support Manchester, the community, when we had the terrible attack on a synagogue last year. Andy was the first person I phoned, and I went straight to Manchester to work with him on our response. So we work very well together, but the actual decision will be one for the NEC. Robert Peston from ITV.
Prime Minister, these were arguably the worst election results for Labour in 100 years. And, I spent all weekend, as you'd expect, talking to your MPs and ministers. And, most of them said to me that they do think your time is up. So what would persuade you that you're not the best person for this job? And just on this issue of this is no longer the time for incremental change, when you were elected, we'd had 15 years of no growth. We'd had Putin's war that led to the worst energy spike in history. Many would say Brexit had failed. Why didn't you get it then?
Well, Robert, look, I'm not going to shy away from the fact that I've got some doubters, including in my own party. And I'm not going to shy away from the fact that I have to prove them wrong, and I will. I had my doubters when I took on the Labour Party. I had my doubters who said we couldn't change this party and make it capable of winning an election. And I proved them wrong. And when we did that, I had my doubters who said, you can't lead us to a general election victory after the loss in 2019, it was so bad. It's not possible. And I proved them wrong. I'm going to prove them wrong again here. I also feel a deep sense of personal responsibility to deliver on the mandate that we won at that 2024 election. The first Labour government for 14 years that had to come in and clear up the mess and build a better Britain. That is what I came into politics to do, and that is what I will deliver. Thank you very much. And Robert, the second, on the incremental. Look, you heard what I said about Scunthorpe. This is an example of the urgency and the pace and the type of decisions that we need to make. The same with Europe. A bigger response, a bigger argument that has been made before, because we're living in different times. The Iran war comes on top of all the other crises we've faced for 20 years. We have to learn the lesson. Every single time in the past, we've simply tried to get back as quickly as possible to a status quo that didn't work. We can't do the same again. That's why we need a bigger response. Thank you very much, Robert. I've got Catherine Foster from GB News. Catherine.
Thank you, Catherine Foster, GB News. Prime Minister, the Labour Party was founded to represent the working class, many of whom voted for Brexit because they felt left behind. You've said yourself that the status quo is not working, but you're standing here in London and you're promising more Europe. You lost so much of your core vote in the Red Wall, in Wales, in Scotland, because working class communities feel that the Labour Party has abandoned them and that you don't get it. Are they wrong?
Well, Catherine, thank you very much. On Brexit, the reason I reminded everyone what Nigel Farage said is because that was the promise he put to the country. That we'd be stronger, we'd be richer, we'd have lots of money for the NHS, immigration would come down, and it all proved to be false. And he doesn't take any responsibility. He's not going back to the country now saying it was a good thing, you've all benefited. He'll talk about almost anything else apart from the consequences of the one thing that he delivered for the country, Brexit. He doesn't want to talk about that. And there's a reason for that. It didn't help working people. It turned out what he said wasn't true. And that's why he doesn't want to talk about it now. But we have to talk about it now. Because we have to address the situation we're in. We have to give this country a stronger economy, a stronger defence and security set of arrangements, given the world we are living in. And that's why I said what I've said about being closer to Europe, and this government being defined by bringing Europe back together again and Britain at the heart of Europe. Thank you very much, Catherine. I've got Pippa from The Guardian. Pippa.
Prime Minister, I've got a specific question for you and a wider one, if I may. The specific one is, if one of your MPs launches a contest, a leadership bid against you, will you fight it? And the wider one is, do you think that Britain is ungovernable? And if so, why? And who's to blame? The media, your MPs, the government, you? Thank you.
Yes and no. No, I'm not going to walk away in relation to the first part of your question for the reasons I've set out. And no, I don't think Britain is ungovernable. On the contrary, one of the things that I draw great strength from is all the millions of people who care passionately about their place, their community, where they live, where they work. The millions of people who give hours and hours and hours of their time for their community, volunteering, helping others, running teams, you name it. That is a great strength of our country. I draw strength from the fact that we are a reasonable, tolerant, decent country, a live and let live country, a diverse country. That is the real Britain. That's not an ungovernable Britain. That is the Britain that I will fight for, particularly in light of the opponents we now have politically, different to the opponents that we had before. That is the real Britain. That is the Britain I love. That's the Britain I'll fight for. Thank you, Pippa. Jim Pickard from the FT. Jim.
Jim Pickard, FT. Prime Minister, you say you don't want incremental change, and you say you want Britain to be at the heart of Europe. Are you ruling out, however, Labour manifesto at the next general election, including single market or custom union membership? Because without either of those things, our economy is very much not in the heart of Europe.
Yeah, well, Jim, what I want to do is take a big leap forward with the EU-UK summit this year and take us closer, both on trade, the economy, defence and security. And that will then be a platform on which we can build as we go forward. And as we do that, I strongly believe we've got to turn our back on the arguments of the past, not open old grievances, but look forward together to how we make this country stronger, how we make this country fairer. And so that's the approach that I will take. I've got Audrey from The Times. Audrey.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Aubrey Allegretti from The Times. To follow up on a previous question, you said that whether Andy Burnham comes back to Parliament is a matter for the NEC. Your business secretary said as much this morning, but he also said that it would be a distraction and that Labour shouldn't be fighting unnecessarily elections. Do you agree with him? Do you think Labour can afford to have 2 by-elections in Greater Manchester for the mayoralty and wherever Andy Burnham returns? And also, if I may, over the weekend, I think you gave an interview in which you suggested that you would like to be Prime Minister for a full 10 years. Some Labour MPs have been unhappy with those comments. Do you still stand by them?
Well, on Andy Burnham, my answer, Aubrey, is the same. That will be a matter for the National Executive Committee if and when the issue arises. But just to be really clear, on a personal level, I've worked very closely with Andy in our respective roles now. The first person I worked for when I came to Parliament was Andy. He wanted me in his team in the Shadow Home Office. I wanted to be in his team in the Shadow Home Office. So we work very well together. We'll continue to work very well together. If the issue arises, it'll be a matter for the NEC. On the decade, look, what I'm doing is spelling out the scale of the challenge that we face. It's the same argument I was making before the election, which is after the damage of the last government, it will take time to clear that damage up and to build the better, stronger country that we need. And that's the decade that I've been talking about. Look, do I recognise that we've got to turn this around? Yes, of course I do. Do I realise that we've got to respond to these elections in the way I've set out in the speech I gave a moment to? Yes, of course I do. And what I've done today is set out how I intend to address that task. Thank you very much, Aubrey. I've got Sophie from the Mirror.
Hi, Sophie Huskisson from the Mirror. Thank you, Prime Minister. So do you agree with Angela Rayner that this could be your last chance to change course and save the Labour Party's future? And do you think the party should move more to the left to become, as you put it, a stronger version of Labour? And if I can just ask as well, since the losses in Wales and Scotland, have you spoken to Eluned Morgan and Anas Sarwar and what was said? Thank you.
Let me take them in reverse order. I've spoken to both Eluned and Anas. I'm not going to go through the conversation, but I have spoken to them, as I've spoken to many of those brilliant representatives who didn't get elected this time, and to council leaders across the country. I've spent a good deal of the weekend having those calls, but those calls did include Eluned and Anas. In relation to the task of turning this around, look, I do understand the enormity of the task that we face. We inherited a terrible legacy from the last government. Economically, public services, the NHS on its knees. And what we found when we got into government was even worse than we feared. And one of the mistakes I think we made was we wanted to level with the country about how bad things were. But we didn't convince people enough in that early period of the change that we would bring about and why their lives would be better. And that's why we have to change that and inject much more hope and optimism into what we are saying. And so I think Angela and I agree. And I've spoken to Angela as well, by the way, so I know exactly what her thinking is in relation to this. Thank you very much. I've got Jack from The Sun.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Jack from The Sun, just on that point, when you did speak to Angela Rayner, did she rule out ever launching a leadership challenge against you? And also, you said in your speech just now that if you were ousted as Labour leader, it would plunge the country into chaos. Some of your critics say your government is already mired in chaos, but can you be clear about what you mean? Are you saying that because it is you with the mandate, if you were ousted, there would have to be a general election?
Well, Jack's a lot bound up with that. I did speak to Angela. I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you by not going. I've spoken to Angela many, many times, by the way, in the last few weeks. We are friends. We get on very well. But I'm not going to go through each and everything that we discussed in those calls. But on this question of chaos, look, The question whether, if a government constantly changes its leadership, the question whether that damages the country is not an academic question. It's not something that you study at university and go through various theories. We tested it. We tested it to destruction under the last government, and it inflicted huge damage on this country. A Labour government will never be forgiven if we repeat that and inflict that on the country. And that's what I mean when I say I'm not going to plunge this country into chaos. Jason from the Mail.
Thanks, PM. That was a heartfelt speech. Your own MPs, though, at the end of last week were saying that you were detested on the doorstep. Those are their words. They said that people are no longer listening to you and that it doesn't matter how many heartfelt speeches you make, your unpopularity is dragging this government down. In those circumstances, don't you owe it to them to step aside and give someone else a go at keeping these forces of darkness at bay?
Well, look, I acknowledged, Jason, a moment ago, there is frustration across the country that at the status quo, which isn't working. There's frustration that politics is not working for too many people. And yes, there is some frustration with me, I acknowledge that. But that frustration that I'm describing has been built up over many, many years by people who feel that their lives are not getting better, that their city centre, their town centre, the place where they live doesn't look any better for them, that their children aren't going to get better chances than they got. That is what's driving that frustration. That is deep, that is political, that is the challenge we have to rise to. I mean, it's not a frustration that can be just cast aside easily. It's deeply bound in the status quo that has failed for so many years, and that's why we have to turn that around. And I've got Bethan McGinley.
Hi.
Bethan.
Hi. So you talked a lot today about giving young people hope again, but for many young Britons, things like home ownership, secure work and financial stability still feel further away than it did for previous generations. Why should they believe that this government can reverse that?
Well, I think it's such a good question because I think young people have been very badly let down, whether that's on opportunities at work. We've got the best part of 1 million people, young people not in work. That's going to have a huge impact on them for the rest of their lives. People who can't get on the housing ladder very quickly or at all. And we have to instill the hope in them. We do that by changing what we're doing to help people get into work. We do that by taking better protections for renters. Too many young people are spending a lot of their income on rent, therefore they can't save their money to pay for a deposit. We're changing that with the Renters' Rights Act, which came into force just a week and a bit ago. And we're changing that with the hope of a better future and the sense in which they will be able to work, travel and study in Europe in a way which hasn't been possible in recent years. And in the end, those young people are our hope, because that's why I gave the example of my mum and dad, and it's a very real example because I think very many people, when they get towards the end of their lives, do reflect and say, what was my life about? And for my mum and dad, in material things, they didn't actually have a lot to show for their lives, but they had this deep comfort. I could really feel it, this deep comfort inside, that they, my mum and dad, Rod and Joe, that they had contributed to a country where the next generation would have better chances. That is the real hope and optimism in young people, and that's where it resides with me, because I think, as I said in the speech, that's the greatest hope of all. So thank you very much for that question. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Try and make sure that he leads the change that the country needed. If we don't get this right, our country will go down a very dark path. I know I have my doubters, I know I have to prove them wrong, and I will. And I guess what he does have to prove to his own MPs is that he is someone who can win for them, again, in places like Wigan and Sunderland, in London. And to do that, he needs to prove he can be more radical as well, something that will, I think, take time to get some of those policies in place. But does he have the time? And the coming hours and days matter an awful lot. Let's get some analysis, shall we? We're joined by our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. You were saying before that the speech mattered, but also the Q&A mattered too. What did you make of what happened?
Well, let's look at the job he tried to do in the speech. And there's a strategy that's evident. He is making it sound more risky to change Prime Minister. A lot of that speech was quite dark and pessimistic in tone. He talked about dangerous times and dangerous opponents and the dark path. And in that light, what he was saying was that there is a deep folly of changing Prime Minister because it causes chaos, raises costs, increases insecurity just at the point where the nation needs a steady hand. His appeal to his party and his appeal to the country is that it is riskier to change than to stay. And that was the job, I think, of the speech. And it was that message that went through the heart of it and was the most important thing of all. There were some developments. We had some policy announcements. The government is now, looks like it's close to resolving the question of what to do with British Steel in Scunthorpe. It's now minded and wants to nationalise it. That will bring onto the books a cost of, it's a lot of money. It's losing £1 million a day. It was sort of, the government took control of it. It was a bit unsatisfactory. There's now a direction for that. He was wrapping it up in ideology, though. He was saying Labour values means nationalisation. That's a shift. That's not the way that he's approached things like that in the past. There was also a passage on Europe where he suggested that we could get closer to Europe. He fudged but didn't rule out whether at the time of the next election that could mean rejoining the single market, rejoining the customs union, rejoining the European Union as a whole. He sort of slightly annoyingly said he didn't want to rerun arguments of the past. There are some in government that don't think the speech meant any of that. But there was another bit in the question and answer. He was asked about the return of Andy Burnham, and he gave a very, very striking answer. And I think in the sort of machinations of today, it's that might be the most important bit. To the question, could Andy Burnham come back? He said, this time, that's a matter for Labour's ruling body, the National Executive. Why does that matter? Because last time, his answer was a straight no, and he led from the front to block Andy Burnham in the National Executive, which he's a member of, and he turned up personally on the Sunday morning to say, don't do it, stay as Manchester Metro Mayor. And I think that just gives a little bit of room, a little bit of wiggle room for those who want to get rid of Keir Starmer but want to wait to have the contest until Andy Burnham's back in. You know, Keir Starmer's almost giving a wink and a nod. You know, maybe that's a possibility.
Yes, and it's important to really kind of emphasise, I think, what a flashpoint this has become, whether or not Andy Burnham is let back in. You know, you talk to Labour MPs and they say if Andy Burnham was in Westminster now, there would be a leadership challenge, right? Which I think shows why Keir Starmer did try and block him in the first place, even though he says it was nothing to do with me, Gov. But also, of course, why there is this groundswell from people on the left as well. He was saying effectively, though, that you know, he was going to run in a leadership contest. He didn't say it explicitly, but he said, you know, I'm not going to walk away.
I think the message is, right now, I'm running. How do you square that, though, with it? Sort of, Keir Starmer has a manner of delivering speeches and taking questions where you're never completely sure at the end of the process where you're left by the series of mildly conflicting statements. So yes, I will meet any challenge, but at the same time, I'm relaxed about Andy Burnham coming back was sort of the hint. So where does that leave us in 6 months' time? Because I think a return to Parliament of Andy Burnham would end up being a direct threat. There was as ever, a sort of mushy middle that he managed to land on. But as we always say, it is Labour MPs who are judge, jury and executioner of the moment. Our verdict is just a piece of analysis. Their verdict is the one that matters to the future of the PM.
Normally we always say that you guys listening are the ones that are most important when it comes to speeches. Sorry, but that's actually not the case today. No offence. It was a speech to Labour MPs, right? It was saying, just don't do anything yet. Give me a chance. Let me prove myself. Let me enact some radical policies. And then we'll see where we are.
Oh, God, it felt like he was launching a sort of leadership campaign. It had that...
Which is bizarre.
It had that vibe about it. You know, it was much closer to what you'd see, the type of address that you'd see when he addresses Labour conference, the personal values bit, the sort of here's my family section. One person who was engaged with this, the speech over the weekend called it a sort of wish list of stuff from 2 years ago that he should have said and enacted then. And there is a sort of, in any reset, there's an attempt to redo stuff that you didn't do well enough first time around. And there was there was a middle section that I felt I'd broadly heard before about him personally and his motivations and where he sits. All of which doesn't really answer the question where there are hard choices to make, where he would go down. A bit of light, but not a huge amount, but some passion and a fair bit of I'm going nowhere for now.
Sam, thank you very much indeed. There you have it. I think there are two really key things to take away. Two things that the Prime Minister didn't do. Firstly, he did not say explicitly that he was going to welcome Andy Burnham back, that he wouldn't be blocked from running. He just said it was a matter for the NEC. Secondly, he did not set out a timetable for when he was going to go. It was the opposite, right? He said that he wants to continue to fight. We don't know what's going to unfold in the coming months, days, or anything like that. I can see Sam wants to make a point to you.
Yes, in just the last few seconds.
20 seconds.
We've had another Labour MP calling for Keir Starmer to go. The moment the speech finished, David Smith said it is now time for the Prime Minister to set out a clear timetable. We've had 3 years not just to convince the British public that we have the answers, we had 3 years to avoid disaster of populism.
Well, I don't need to tell you that was not the response the Prime Minister was hoping for. More coming up.
Hello, this is Sky News Today. It's 11 o'clock, the headlines. Keir Starmer insists he won't walk away from number 10 as he admits he failed to convince the British people that their lives will improve.
I know I have my doubters, and I know I need to prove them wrong, and I will.
In a surprise announcement, the Prime Minister also announced that British Steel will be fully nationalised. We'll also have full reaction to the make or break speech as we wait to hear what the former Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner has to say this lunchtime. Hello, good morning. Sir Keir Starmer has vowed to prove his doubters wrong, promising to be better and do better in a make or break speech as he fights for his position to stay in number 10. Well, this comes after Labour suffered huge losses across Britain in last week's local election, something Sir Keir Starmer also took responsibility for. And there's been growing calls for him to step down, with more than 30 Labour MPs now publicly calling for him to go.
The election results last week were tough, very tough. We lost some brilliant Labour representatives. That hurts. And it should hurt. I get it. I feel it. And I take responsibility. But it's not just about taking responsibility for the results. It's about taking responsibility to explain how, as a political and electoral force, we will be better and do better in the months and years ahead. Because we are not just facing dangerous times, but dangerous opponents, very dangerous opponents. This hurts not just because Labour has done badly, but because if we don't get this right, our country will go down a very dark path. So just as I take responsibility for the results, I also take responsibility for delivering the change that we promised, for a stronger and fairer Britain that we must build. I take responsibility for navigating us through a world that is more dangerous than at any time in my life. And I take responsibility for not walking away, not plunging our country into chaos, as the Tories did time and again. Chaos that did lasting damage to this country. A Labour government would never be forgiven for inflicting that on our country again. I know that people are frustrated by the state of Britain, frustrated by politics, and some people frustrated with me. I know I have my doubters, and I know I need to prove them wrong, and I will.
Yeah, finishing up his speech, he made it clear he'll be fighting on for a better Britain, which he says only Labour can deliver.
This is nothing less than a battle for the soul of our nation. And I want to be crystal clear about how we will win it. Because we cannot win as a weaker version of Reform or the Greens. We can only win as a stronger version of Labour, a mainstream party of power, not protest. And I also want to be really clear on this, because I will never stop fighting for the decent, respectful, diverse country that I love. I will never give up on the hope we can unlock in this country, the hope of renters for security in their home, of workers for fairness at work, of public services freed from austerity, the hope of European solidarity, of community pride, of the people who paint over the graffiti that is racist, a country taking control of its future, our spirit unchanged, our resolve unbroken, the hope of a country that can and will become a stronger, fairer Britain. That is the hope I'm fighting for. That is the hope we are fighting for. That is the Labour choice.
Yeah, we're joined by Sam Coates to just pick through all of what we've heard. He's done reset speeches before, Sam. What did you think that was different about this one that we saw?
Well, let's take the sort of main argument he was making at face value. He is trying to make clear to his party and to the country that there's just an enormous risk in terms of changing leader. He talked about dangerous times and dangerous opponents, to which he quite clearly is referring to Nigel Farage and a bit of Zach Polanski, and is sort of in between the lines. He's basically saying, if you get rid of me, you're increasing the chance of, you know, essentially ending up with one of those in number 10. And he was essentially trying to make it clear that there is a risk and it goes up if you get rid of me. The question is, where does his vision leave the country, and is the party happy with it? Well, there are a couple of policy announcements. The first one was about nationalising British Steel in Scunthorpe. That's resolving an issue that we already knew the government had that was a bit of a mess. Scunthorpe Steelworks losing £1 million a day some days. You know, this will create a problem possibly for the Treasury, and nationalising it. Interesting, he was couching it in the frame of Labour values. Nationalisation hasn't previously been a go-to ideological sort of lever that he's wanted to pull, but it sounded like he was more in favour of it in principle. The second one was, again, slightly opaque language about wanting Europe to be at the heart of things. But again, not clear whether this Parliament or next Parliament we would see a change to the red lines of not going back to the customs union or the single market, or maybe rejoining. He says that that's all about the arguments of the past. There was also an important kind of clarification, as it were, in the question and answer session. He made it clear that he wouldn't walk away, but he said that it wasn't for him, really, as to whether or not Andy Burnham could come back. It's for the National Executive Committee to decide if he can leave the job of Metro Mayor and stand in the Westminster seat. Now, that matters because that's a very different answer from the one that he gave last time that question was posed a couple of months back. He's a member of the NEC. He led the meeting effectively saying Andy Burnham should stay as Metro Mayor. Now his stance has pivoted. Where does that leave us? Well, he wants to fight, but he's prepared to see one of his main rivals come back. There's some incremental change, but he's highlighting the risks of people coming for him and suggesting that he'd face them down. I can't read this, if I'm being honest. Let's see the reaction of Labour MPs. Just since we've had that speech, one of them has said that he should go. That's David Smith. He says the Prime Minister should now set out a clear timetable for his departure. Let's see if that drip turns into a flow.
And what's interesting, for those people who decided from Labour to vote reform, say, does this speech, I wonder, do anything different about how they view, how the public views the Prime Minister now?
So there's a big argument going on in Labour circles about how to deal with what happened last Thursday. Yes, large swathes of the country that were red turned turquoise, reform. But is the route back to that through trying to knit together a sort of rainbow coalition on the left, or is it to deal with the concerns of people who might vote reform? And are there really so many Labour to reform switchers as there are people peeling off at the other end of Labour's electoral coalition? That's an argument that political scientists differ on. But it looked to me like Keir Starmer had picked a side. He was messaging to those maybe traditional Labour supporters, going, I hear your concerns, I'm going to lean into your worries. This wasn't a speech that went hard on migration, reform's top issue. It wasn't a speech, it was a speech that essentially lambasted and called a threat Nigel Farage. You know, I think we can say millions of former Labour voters voted for Nigel Farage last week. How do they take to that sort of casting of a person that effectively, in order to kick the government, they have lent their support to? I think that there is a direction of travel, and I think there'll be a big argument about whether it's the right one.
OK, we'll leave it there for now. Sam, thanks so much for your company. We're going to drop into our political editor, Beth Rigby, now. Beth, you were in the room during that speech. How did it land?
Well, look, in the room, I think what you saw there from the Prime Minister was someone that clearly knew what was at stake, and he was really trying to inject a bit of emotion and passion into his address to the party, but really beyond that room, to his MPs that might be thinking that his time is up and considering whether to join a potential leadership challenge against him. So in the room, it was very interesting. The activists were very difficult questions. So in the room, there was a lot of passion and emotion from the Prime Minister. I think in terms of the tone of it, what I picked up was a Prime Minister that seemed to be saying to his party, I have heard you, I appreciate I can't govern by spreadsheets and evidence, that I need to tell a personal story and talk about emotion, to talk about the working people that I want to represent. And he got quite a big applause when he said, I'm fighting for working people, I'm their Prime Minister, I'm going to fight for them. In the room, that was quite an electrifying moment with this spontaneous round of applause. So I think he knew what he wanted to do and what he needed to do in terms of trying to inject a bit of passion into the job. But look, I think on the substance of it, there wasn't really much in it. It was quite thin gruel. There was talk about opportunities for young people, but no flashing that out. There was the announcement on Scunthorpe and British Steel, one concrete action nationalising British Steel. There was talk about Europe and coming closer to Europe, whilst also maintaining red lines, because Labour basically don't want to return to freedom of movement. They think that that would be very damaging with the electorate. So how far really can they go on that? And in that speech, there wasn't a really eye-catching, radical, I sense the urgency, here's a big policy or idea. So I think it fell a bit short on that. Whilst he was speaking, a few MPs messaged me. One said, nothing says I get it and I feel it, like reading an auto cue about what your feelings are. Another one messaged me and said, this is vague and meaningless, nowhere near good enough. And David Smith, an MP, within minutes of the Prime Minister sitting down, he said that he thought Starmer should resign. But look, in terms of where the Prime Minister is, I think he made a few things very clear. One, he made it clear that he will fight any challenge. Two, he made it clear again that he wasn't walking away. When I asked him whether he even contemplated resigning, he simply said no, it will plunge the country into chaos. And thirdly, he said, I know I have my doubters, I will prove them wrong. So he is fighting on. I think now we've got to see how it lands, how it settles with the parliamentary party. What is... Sorry, it's a bit noisy. There's police cars coming past, if you can still hear me. I think we've got to see now how it lands with MPs. Catherine West is mulling, as she has said over the weekend, whether it's enough for her. Is she going to try and trigger a leadership ballot? So it's all very uncertain, very febrile. And I was talking to a number of contacts at the top of the party all over the weekend. And honestly, people don't know how this is going to land. Even a few of the Prime Minister's inner circle would acknowledge that privately too.
Beth, what did you make of the steel announcement? Do you think this was the biggest concrete policy?
Yeah, look, that was about Scunthorpe and the issue around that plant, and the Prime Minister said we're going to bring forward legislation to nationalise British Steel. That was a concrete policy. Undoubtedly, that bill to legislate for that piece of legislation will be in the King's speech on Wednesday, and that's when the government will set out its agenda for this parliamentary term. But if you look at what Angela Rayner was talking about on Sunday night, last night, when she put out a very long essay, really, about the Prime Minister needing to meet the moment and bring change to the country, she was talking about far more radical ideas, really. I mean, she was talking about broader nationalisation. She was talking about perhaps beginning to look at whether to end freeholds for good. She was talking about raising taxes on the wealthy to put more money into the pockets of working people. She was talking about raising the minimum wage. And I think in terms of the concrete policy, yes, he made that announcement on British Steel, but there wasn't anything about perhaps, I don't know, nationalising water, for example, something really big and bold and radical that would perhaps galvanise the party or get them thinking, yeah, Keir Starmer does get it, this sense of urgency. It was a very political speech as opposed to a policy speech. And look, when it comes back down to it, they have done absolutely shockingly bad in this set of elections, one of the worst performances ever. 5 years ago, when the Prime Minister was leader of the opposition and they had a terrible set of local election results, he admitted that he had thought about resigning because was he holding the party, the country back? This is what MPs are talking about. Is Keir Starmer holding them back? Is it time for him to go? So I asked him about that, whether he had thought about that, contemplated that in the interests of the country. This is our exchange, if you want to have a listen. Back in 2021, when Labour lost hundreds of council seats in the Hartlepool by-election, you thought about resigning as Labour leader, explaining, this is quoting you, "I didn't feel I should be bigger than the party." But these results, this moment, is so much worse than then. You've lost nearly 1,500 councillors, 40 councils, you've lost Wales. Haven't you, for one moment, thought you should step aside in the interests of the party and country? And if you haven't, why haven't you? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Beth. I think what we witnessed with the last government was the chaos of constantly changing leaders. And it cost this country a huge amount. A huge amount. And I'll tell you who paid the price. It was working people. They paid the price of this. They are still paying the price of this. A Labour government will not inflict that on our country again. We were elected with a mandate to change this country because of what had gone before. And that is what we will do. Yes, I acknowledge the frustration. Yes, I acknowledge the results are tough. Yes, I acknowledge that we've lost brilliant representatives across the United Kingdom. And I have a responsibility for that. but I also have a responsibility to deliver the change that we were elected and that we promised this country, and I'll deliver on that. Thank you very much, Beth.
What did Victoria, what's Vic said to you this weekend?
Vic is a rock, and we talk everything through together, as you know.
So, look, the Prime Minister there, when I said, look, have you not even thought about resigning? And, I mean, I don't know about you watching at home, but I wonder, how can you not think about that, given the predicament that you are in, given what your MPs are saying? Over 40 now, we think, calling for him to go. And he was absolutely steely about it, wasn't he? I'm not going to plunge the country into chaos. He went on to say that he would fight any leadership challenge. He said he knew that he had his doubters. He was going to prove his doubters wrong. And I think now we have to wait to see how that speech lands with MPs. Are the numbers going to tick up? Will it cross the threshold where there really are 81 MPs prepared to put their name to a letter calling for a leadership contest, backing Catherine West, who is at the moment the only person that's put her head above the fray and said there should be a challenge? Will she back down? Will Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, decide to go out there and challenge Keir Starmer directly? As I understand it, he's made it clear that he is not going to directly challenge, but he is waiting in the wings should a leadership race begin. But might that change over the next 24 hours? Angela Rayner making it clear, I think, on Sunday that she would be prepared to go for it should Andy Burnham not be back into Parliament. And that was another thing he was asked about. Should he let Andy Burnham back in to Westminster? And he deferred on that, saying that that's a matter for the party's governing body. But of course, he has his allies and enemies on that body. So not trying to avoid really the question on a return of Andy Burnham. It's so up in the air. I think over the next 24 to 48 hours, it will become clearer what the fate of Keir Starmer is going to be.
OK, Beth, for now, thank you so much. For now, at least, the Prime Minister isn't walking away. Let's talk more about this then. Joining Sam and I now is David Pinto-Tuchinski, the Labour MP for Hendon, that's in northwest London. Thanks for your time today, David. You heard the speech. What did Starmer do today that he hasn't done before?
Well, I think what we saw today was a Prime Minister rising to the occasion. You heard and saw humility. I think you saw him take responsibility, but you also heard and saw the passion and the complete determination, not just to make incremental change, but to make real, substantive, major radical change. To change, a status quo that isn't working for people. I was incredibly struck. I mean, listening to Beth, we heard in that speech about the nationalisation of British steel. We heard in the speech a move to put Britain back at the heart of Europe. And we heard in that speech a determination to make sure that a system that has let down so many young people will be changed to offer everyone, every young person who needs it, a guaranteed job or a guaranteed work placement or a guaranteed apprenticeship. Those are really big moves. And look, obviously, this is only one speech. You can't fix everything with one speech. And we're going to be seeing the King's speech on Wednesday. We're going to be seeing other things. So this is the start of a bigger conversation about that, real ambition and the scale of ambition we have for this country. But do remember, this is a Prime Minister who has faced down many challenges before. As Beth said, 5 years ago, we saw the Hartlepool election, and this is a Prime Minister who went on to turn around the party, to win an election that no one said we could win, and then to provide real leadership to the country. And we've seen it on the issue of Iran, where he provided leadership to keep us out of a war that every other party leader would have taken us into. And it's that leadership he's shown again today.
But hand on heart, do you feel this speech has actually changed anything for voters who drifted away at those local elections, which were a disaster?
Look, I'm not here to sugarcoat those elections. They were incredibly tough, and we need to learn a lot from them. But I think the message that I certainly took on the doorsteps where the people are impatient for change and they want to see us deliver. And what the Prime Minister was saying today was firstly that he gets it and really showing that he gets it. Secondly, laying out the Labour case for change. But thirdly and critically, showing how he is going to be laser focused on delivery. That's what you're going to see from this Prime Minister. That's what you're going to see from this government. And that's why I think this speech is so welcome and so important.
David, it's Sam Coates. You talk about how big and bold the Prime Minister's offer was today. Forgive me, I'm a little bit confused. Can you explain what the Europe policy amounts to? Because as far as I can see, your red lines are still in place about no membership of the customs union in the single market. So how can the rhetoric live up to the reality?
Well, look, as I say, I mean, I'm not going to write the detail here on kind of live television.
You were the guy that was just enthusing about something. Now you say you don't understand it.
Well, no. But I think we haven't even touched the sides of what is capable within the red lines drawn by the manifesto. And I think you heard, Sam, whether it's on youth mobility and the big bold offer for young people, and whether it's other things coming out of the European summit. You'll also be aware of, for instance, the phytosanitary regulations that are going to have a real impact on food prices.
Forgive me, David. In the local election campaign,
of ASDA and Morrison's. I'm saying that as well. I think there's a real opportunity to build a completely different kind of relationship, and on issues like even standing up on issues such as Greenland. We've seen the importance and the impact of having a different kind of relationship with Europe, and that's what...
Sorry, David, I do want to jump in here. How many times did phytosanitary rules and the youth mobility scheme come up on the doorstep in this local election campaign?
So I think what came up a lot was a sense that we're not seeing the economic change we want to see, that we want problems to be solved. And as Keir said in the speech, a key part of that is acknowledging the damage Brexit did and acknowledging that we need a proper deep reset of our relationship with Europe, and that's what he'll deliver.
I suppose my frustration is you just can't see where his end point is. He's not spelling out a specific endpoint. So one of the frustrations I think that there is with Keir Starmer is that, in the end, the direction is opaque. That's true of this Europe policy as well. We don't know whether in the next, Labour manifesto you'll be promising to rejoin the EU, go back in the customs union, go back in the single market, or whether the destination is some way short of that. There's a form of words that leaves you completely floundering as to where we're going.
But I don't think that's fair, Sam. I think the direction's really clear towards a much closer relationship with Europe. What you're flagging up is that, I'm not in a position today, directly after the speech, to dot every I and cross every T on the detail. But that's exactly what the nature of a summit is. That is what you go and negotiate. But I don't think that's correct to say the direction is not clear. The direction is crystal clear, which is putting Britain back at the heart of Europe, which is not where it's been. And if you look at the last government, if you look at the damage done to our relationships, and that wasn't just a diplomatic and political damage, that has crystallised into long queues at passports, costlier food, more barriers for exporters. There's real damage that's been done by Brexit, and the Prime Minister's clear that he's going to be resetting that relationship to undo that damage and build a new kind of settlement with Europe that allows us to get, really benefit from a deeper relationship.
We've had 6 conference speeches by Keir Starmer. We've had an entire general election campaign. Why is this moment, this morning, a moment where you're seeing passion from the Prime Minister that's meant to convince people that he's different to what we've seen for 6 years now? What did we see in that speech that is a sort of marked change from all of those different moments where he's rolled up his sleeves, told us his backstory, told us his journey, told us his passion for the country? Why is this morning different?
Well, look, as he said himself, it's not just about analysis. You've got to win the argument. It's not just about spreadsheets. It's about stories. And I think, Keir is acknowledging that we need to do more of that. And that's exactly what you're seeing. And I think we'll continue to see. And as I said, this is just the first act. We clearly have the King's speech coming on Wednesday, where you will have more detail about what the government wants to achieve and more of the kind of powerful storytelling around that. But, I think this is a Prime Minister who is signalling that he gets it, that is hearing with humility the message coming from the British people, but is absolutely determined to meet that challenge and meet that moment. And I think in this speech, we see that he's taken steps to do that.
David, what does Keir Starmer need to do then between now and conference to make sure his message sticks?
Well, look, I mean, first and foremost, this is about delivering. This is why myself and so many colleagues, think it's really important that we don't turn in on ourselves and have a conversation with ourselves as a party. Our overwhelming priority must be delivering for the country. So that is priority one. And then priority two, alongside that, is articulating that powerful message, articulating that story. That's what you heard today, and that's, I think, what you'll continue to hear over the coming weeks.
OK, we'll leave it there. David, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
You're watching Sky News. Coming up after the break, we'll have more analysis from Keir Starmer's speech this morning. Stay with us.